All you have to do is ask. The EU says the offer to bail out Ireland still stands. Why is the Irish government dragging its feet? Is it embarrassed or fearful of risking sovereign control? Is Ireland in a position to reject an aid package from the EU? Or is it simply buying time? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Saving the Celtic tiger or not? A team of international financial experts from the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund is in Dublin right now. They're discussing ways to deal with Ireland's crippling debt crisis. Ireland's leaders have still not committed to accepting an aid package despite international pressure. But the head of the central bank now says he expects a substantial loan running to tens of billions of dollars to be made available to shore up the economy. This is how Ireland's situation could affect the rest of Europe. It has the highest rate of national debt in Europe, according to Eurostat. Now, if you include debt from Irish banks, it's 32%. The government wants to manage on its own. It has got enough cash for the next 6 months, and on the 7th of December, it is set to announce an austerity budget. But it's looking increasingly like a deal will be struck. Greece has already received a massive bailout. And there are fears that if Ireland defaults, Spain and Portugal could be next. That's why the economic powerhouses, in particular Germany, are pushing so hard. The whole bloc, including the 16 countries that use the euro, are at risk. Up to $110 billion could be given to Ireland, but it would come with strings attached, and that might make the country less competitive. Currently, its attractive rate of corporate tax is a big draw to foreign investors. Joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests in Dublin, Dick Rocha, Minister of European Affairs from the Government of Ireland in London, Louis Galgor, Chief Investment Officer of LNG Capital, a London-based hedge fund, in Singapore, Jim Rogers. He's an author and international financial investor. Mr. Rocha, since we're talking about your country, are you going to take the money, take the pain?
Well, I think it's very important from your viewer's point of view to just set the record. The Irish government has made incredible cuts, adjustments in our public spending over the last 2 years, 2.5 years. We've taken approximately 15 billion out, which in Irish terms is huge. We've committed to front-loading a further 6 billion in cuts in our budget, which comes up next month. And we have also committed to preparing a plan for 4 years. And by the end of the next budgetary cycle, by the end of December 2011, we will be 2/3 of the way to meeting the EU requirement of a 3% deficit by 2014. In addition to that, we have cash reserves on hand of 22 billion in our National Treasury Management Agency, and we have another 25 billion in our pension fund. Now, it's not a question of our being obdurate or a question of our being reluctant to talk with our European partners, because our European partners have recognised that we have done the right things. In fact, this week, the ECOFIN ministers, the finance ministers, endorsed all of the proposals, that all of the things that we have done, including our banking guarantee, including the recapitalisation of our banks, and including the establishment of a national asset management agency to take assets off the books of the distressed banks.
Okay, I mean, I don't think anybody's denying that, excuse me interrupting, that Ireland has done enough to try and stop the economic rot within your country, but clearly it's not enough. And I'm not sure whether you're saying with that answer, which all sounds very impressive, whether you're going to be taking cash or not.
No, what I am saying is that in spite of all of those measures, and this was the point again made by the finance ministers during the week, the market hasn't stabilised as would be expected. So it's very clear that not just Ireland, but all the members of the Eurozone must sit down and we must come to some common understanding as to what is necessary. There's no point whatsoever in making commitments before you actually have the negotiations and the discussions underway. We've made it very clear that we are of course willing to cooperate with our partners. We of course have issues that we want to defend and we would always defend. But that's not the issue which is at stake.
But surely the longer you take, the more the panic.
No, well, sorry, I can't. As I say, we have done all the right things. We actually are liquid. We have funding in place. If people panic, that's not our cause. But we are engaged. We are anxious to resolve the issue, and we are certainly willing to play our part. But we have a role to play, and it is not, as I say, we have to understand and reach a common understanding with our European partners as to what is necessary before we make any decision. It would be ludicrous for any sovereign government to say, oh yes, well, notwithstanding the strengths of our position, we're going to just capitulate to somebody else's view.
Okay.
We want to know what is the view and what is to be done and what is the common understanding as to the results that we need to achieve.
Okay, let me put what you've said to Mr. Gargaud. It sounds to me as if Mr. Rocha is saying that they're not going to be taking the money. Do you think that's the way forward, the correct way forward for Ireland?
Well, I think the minister was saying that they don't need to take the money right now. And there's a very big difference between saying we don't need the money now and we won't need it at some point in the future. The markets, unfortunately, whether or not they are capricious or emotional, are always right. And what the markets are saying now is that it costs between 7 and 8% for Ireland to borrow in 10-year bonds, and those bonds trade at 80 cents of face, or 80% of face. So my point here isn't so much that they have cash. The future funding profile for Ireland is uncertain. Where they borrow and at what cost they borrow, especially given the statistics you gave, 32% budget deficit, 13% unemployment, GDP growth, which this year is set to be less than zero. So it's not a problem that's going to go away, and certainly the funding cost or the aspect of where they fund is a very big question mark.
Do you think, though, that the EU, the IMF, if Ireland does go that route, can really ask the Irish to do more than they've already done?
I think a big question mark in Ireland is how much of the aid that they are going to eventually be offered, whether or not they take it is another question, is going to come from the IMF. How much is going to come from the UK, which is outside, if you will, the Euro zone, and how much is going to come from Europe itself and be Euro denominated? I think the IMF is going to do the same thing with Ireland as they haven't done in Greece and they've done in Argentina, a variety of other countries that have been helped, is they're going to give them targets and they're going to measure them very regularly in terms of how they meet those targets.
Mr. Rogers, what do you make of the minister's response?
Well, with all due respect to Mr. Rocha, I think he's making a terrible mistake. I think Ireland, which is bankrupt, should go ahead and declare bankruptcy. Even Mr. Rocha said that by 2014 they will still have a 3% deficit. The debt's going up, the debt's not going down. Your debt's going to be a staggering drag on the Irish economy for years to come. You're going to have immigration out of Ireland again after having a decade or two of immigration in and dramatic growth. I don't know why Irish taxpayers or European taxpayers or anybody should pay for the mistakes of banks and entrepreneurs. When I make a mistake, Mr. Rocha, next time I'd like to call you up and let you bail me out too. I find this absurd. Why should anybody bail out banks and entrepreneurs who've made mistakes?
Let's put that to Mr. Rocha. That's a very good question. Why are banks getting the money and not the people?
Well, may I make a point to Mr. Rogers that, of course, what triggered the most recent excitements in the market was a suggestion by the German Chancellor that private sector would take some of the pain. And of course, she was talking in the context of post-2013, because arrangements have been put in place up to 2013, and those arrangements will stand. In the Irish case, we've introduced banking guarantees. They were agreed by the European Commission. They were endorsed by the European Commissioner. They were endorsed by our own central bank. So with respect, the other point I would make to you is when you suggest that somehow or other a 3% deficit by 2014 is somehow or other abnormal, I would just simply remind you that's actually the aspiration for the whole of the Eurozone. That's what the Eurozone wants. We didn't set that particular target, and I'm making the point that it's impressive, notwithstanding the current difficulties, that we can reach this target. Now, coming back to the contribution that was made about Ireland's debt and the borrowing and the cost of borrowing going forward and whether the market acts rationally or not, I actually agree with that comment. It doesn't matter whether there is rationality in the marketplace. Maynard Keynes absolutely said some time back, or many years ago, that markets are not always rational. And you do have to deal with the markets as they are. And notwithstanding all the work that has been done, we have to put in place a mechanism that will stabilise the markets. We're going to do that in common with our European partners.
But how do you do that, Mr. Excuse me, interrupting here.
Going to happen.
Mr. Gargo, I saw that you were nodding away there. But do you think it's the banks that have to be tackled now? Because that's the faulty issue at heart here, isn't it?
Well, I'll digress into simple economics. Normally, when you have different currencies that are not linked, i.e. not the Eurozone, but the Irish pound, the Greek drachma, etc., you would have some sort of banking crisis, an increase in unemployment, an increase in indebtedness, and the natural progression of the market would be to devalue the currency. That would make the country more competitive on a relative basis to its peers, to its neighbors. You're able to export goods and products. Your unit labor costs go down in Ireland or in Greece vis-a-vis the Eurozone. In this particular case, the problem is the euro. Now, the euro would have been a mechanism for an explicit or an implicit devaluation of assets in that country. So the second part of a bailout, and I'm not talking about just Ireland, I'm talking about Greece, likely to be Portugal, and potentially, we'll see what happens, Spain. The second part of a bailout is then a restructuring, an extension of maturities, and some form of haircut of the domestic or government debt. That makes it, if you will, makes the debt burden relative to GDP less and enables the country to what I would call grow into its debt burden. I mean, the burden is 32% of GDP. The cost of borrowing is 7%. If you actually do the numbers, you find that the fiscal adjustment necessary is way beyond what you can do in 1, 2, or 3 years. It's a longer-term program. So some form of debt forgiveness, the debt has been transferred now from the banks onto the government's balance sheet. So the forgiveness has to happen at the government level. Some form of restructuring needs to happen in peripheral Europe. And I'm not pointing my finger at Ireland only, but there are, if you will, a confluence of factors that make people concerned in Europe about what they're seeing.
What about a different route, Mr. Rogers? What about defaulting? What's wrong with that?
That's what I'm saying. Why not default or take the haircut? Well, either way, you're going to have to take a huge haircut. Go ahead and do the default now. Mr. Roche says we're still going to have a deficit of 3%. Well, that's admirable, Mr. Roche, but it's still a deficit. It means the debt is still rising by 2014. That doesn't solve your problem. You've got a problem of too much debt. The only way you're going to pay that debt down is to default or take a haircut or call it what you will, or you're going to have decades of abnormal undergrowth in Ireland, which I don't think the Irish taxpayers should have to put up with because other people made mistakes.
Mr. Rocha, I mean, isn't that the cheaper way of going forward? I mean, look at Argentina, for example. They defaulted. They were sitting at the table of G20. They haven't done too badly.
Well, I wouldn't make the comparisons with Argentina. I'm relatively familiar with what has happened to Argentina. I've been backwards and forwards there a couple of times. I don't think that is a model I would particularly like Ireland to copy. In fact, what we have done, and Mr. Rogers may or may not be aware of this, is that the people who actually held the debt, that was of course the banks and the various financial institutions, they have taken a massive haircut in this country because we have transferred assets at 70% haircut level, up to 70% haircut, into the National Treasury Management Agency, which will work through dealing with that debt and those assets over a 10-year period. And that is, in fact, a model that was applied very successfully in some of the Scandinavians, particularly in Sweden. And that's, in fact, the model that we're working on there. On the issue of default, the reality is that if you actually go the route of default and you're an economy that, an Irish economy is very open, it's an economy that depends very much on our reputation internationally. It depends on our capacity to attract foreign direct investment. We have always honoured our responsibilities, and we don't see a default. Certainly when guarantees have been given, we don't see that is an appropriate or even a moral way forward.
Isn't that the problem facing your country,
yes.
Ireland's reputation at the moment? I mean, if we look forward now, some are saying that the Irish economy could be even worse than it seemed. Analysts are saying that the cost of bailing out Irish banks could be double what the government is estimating. It could be at least $81 billion. At that rate, the government's expected spending cuts, estimated to be worth around $20 billion over 4 years, would fall far short of what's needed. And the crunch is getting closer to home. Up till now, it's been big property developers and companies that have been getting hit. But 1 in 8 people with mortgages are already struggling to meet repayments. And when the spending cuts bite, the trickle of people losing their homes may become a flood. Mr. Rogers, with all that in mind, are large multinationals deserting Ireland irrespective of any bailout?
Well, to Mr. Rocha's point, Mr. Rocha, you rely on direct foreign investment.
That.
Yes, of course, any economy does. But who's going to invest in a country with the statistics which have been recited here by all four of us tonight? Why would anybody want to put money into a country that's going to have a huge burden and huge anchor for years to come?
I'll give you a quick answer.
Any way the country can grow.
I'll give you a quick answer for that. If you wish, I'll give you a quick answer for that.
Go ahead.
The Irish economy has, and Ireland has provided over the last 25 years, has provided an extraordinarily benign investment source for foreign direct investment. Companies that have come to this country have done extraordinarily well. We have a young, dynamic, very well educated and extremely flexible workforce. We have a very, very competitive tax rate. It's not the lowest in Europe, but it is one of them. I beg your pardon?
I said many of them are leaving. You've got the native Irish leaving. Many of the Poles who've been propping up the economy there, they're leaving.
Sorry, can I just make a point, right? Just make a point on that specific canard, if I may. We have a situation where we came close to 2 million people in employment in Ireland. It's now somewhat below that, and we have high levels of unemployment. We are still infinitely higher than we were 10 years ago. We are still much more progressive and dynamic than we were 10 years ago. We are still the country that can attract more foreign direct investment than the BRICS can, all of them in one place. And that's not because people have behaved irrationally or sentimentally towards Ireland. It's because this is a very, very good place in which to do business. And we want to continue with that. And the idea that if you default and you walk, sorry if I, Mr. Roger, make the point, the idea that you can default, you can walk away and leave debts somehow or other is an honourable way to do business. Is not a view that we share. We do accept that there was very bad mistakes made in our banking area. We've introduced new regulation. We have completely changed the procedures there, and we will continue to do so. And we will do so with the European Union. But we're not going to. We're not. The place that we're at the moment is we want to hear what our friends in Europe have in mind. We want to sit down with them. We want to be progressive, and we want to be positive with them.
Mr. Rogers is dying
to
respond to that,
yes.
Mr. Roach.
Mr. Roach, I don't find it honorable that taxpayers would have to go and bail out incompetent people. You give incompetent people the money that competent people have saved or accumulated who didn't make mistakes. You give that money to the incompetent people and say to the incompetent people, now you compete with the competent people with their money. That is bad morality, but it is worse economics. You say Ireland's had a great 25 years. They did. Listen, I've invested in Ireland 10 years ago. I've written wonderful things about Ireland. But that was then. Then people started making huge mistakes, and you're suggesting, well, we made mistakes, but so what? We made mistakes. Nothing has to change. Boy, I don't understand how you can even say that after 10 years of mistakes, that nothing has to change.
Should we listen to what
That's not a
the taxpayer has to say?
Where I am or where the Irish government is.
Let's listen to what the taxpayer has to say. On the streets of Dublin, people had differing views on what their government should do. Here is some of their comments.
We just don't know who to believe at the moment. We're hearing so many different stories. So it's a mixed bag, really. We're hoping we can get out of it.
It does worry me. You know, I'm a homeowner, one baby, 2 working parents, and all we can see ahead of us now, ahead of the budget, is tax raises, you know, PRSI cuts, etc., etc., and a good few years of pain. And that's all.
What else do we do if, you know, if we need help and we have to get it, but what's the outcome going to be? You know, don't know.
Not very good, is it, Mr. Gargo? It seems that the burden needs to be shared by more people, doesn't it?
Well, can I make a simple observation, right? And I'm an investor, so I don't have a political angle, nor do I think, you know, the country needs to default. The main problem with Ireland is that there has been a bubble built up in real estate. Commensurate with that bubble, there's also been a very large percentage of the employment that has been directly related to that sector. So what are we going through globally? We're going through an asset bubble deflation. Asset prices have come off, specifically housing. The banks have been the main lenders to the housing and to the commercial housing industry. You need a tax base to address GDP, to address debt. we have massive debt, we have a deflated tax base, i.e. 13% unemployment, and we have a scenario where borrowing costs are going up. My suggestion would not be so much we default, which is a polite way of saying you restructure debt. My suggestion would be that you fund yourself from the ECB at, let's say, 3, 4, 5%, cheap funding for the short term. You then look at your liability asset profile, you restructure debt so that you're more competitive, so that the tax base can actually pay for debt servicing, and to put yourself in a more competitive situation to emerge out of this. So in other words, some pain has to be transferred to the taxpayer, but also some has to be written off so that Ireland is more competitive over the long period of time.
Do you think this issue could have been averted, or the extent of it, if the stress tests had been true, Mr. Rogers?
Well, I would like to ask Mr. Gargo first. Mr. Gargo, how do you expect them to earn their way out of this? You say that they will not default, or they shouldn't default. Or either of you, or any of the three of you, how is Ireland going to earn its way out of this without many, many, many years of struggling? I don't see the numbers. The numbers don't add up.
The numbers don't add up, and that's specifically what I'm saying. In a way, I agree with you. What I'm saying is they need to restructure debt, write some off, haircut, whatever you want to call it, as long as, and as well as extend the debt maturity, because they've got $10 billion coming due next year. They've got a 2014 maturity profile, which is pretty onerous. So my suggestion is that some is written off and that the debt is termed out so that it can be grown into. So I do agree with you. I just think it needs to be orchestrated so that the markets don't take it the wrong way.
Let's throw this into
well, okay, I certainly understand an organized bankruptcy or an organized haircut, call it what you will, an organized default. Maybe you don't want to use the word default because that scares people. But somebody can, in the U.S. or in many countries, when companies get into trouble, they sit down with their creditors and the management, and they reorganize. They have a prearranged bankruptcy is what they call it. Ireland needs that. Nothing else is going to solve the problem.
Well, I think that's what's going on.
Do you think that this is the beginning of
the
the end of the Eurozone? I mean, do you often hanker back to the good old days where you could control your own currency, print your own money?
Well, we did have our own currency. It was closely linked to sterling, and we were never really in the sovereign control that other member states or other states that had their independent currencies would have. No, I don't think it's the end of the euro, but I do think it's a very big challenge. And if I make the point, I was agreeing there with Mr. Gargan to the point that he was making, that you do have to grow your tax base. We do have a narrow tax base. We've already started to adjust to that. We've accepted that. We have narrowed our tax base, and that has been a strategic error over the years. It actually meant that we were able to grow very rapidly, and it of course meant that we were very competitive, and it addressed internal issues that we have. That's an issue that the government's already committed to looking at, and part of the 6 billion adjustment that's going to be made in the 2011 budget will be in that particular direction. We've already given some ballpark figures. I make the point, Mr. Rogers, I simply think, and I don't wish to be in any way patronising, and please accept this as a comment, it's not meant to be in any way patronising. I think the extent of the adjustment that has happened when the assets were taken off the banking from the banks, and the amount of the haircut they have had to take has been absolutely astronomical. It's been quite extraordinary, the figures. Now, we've put all those assets into the National Treasury Management Agency, and that is a way of handling it forward. What we do need to do now is sit down and listen to the various people who have been talking in Europe for the last week or 10 days and saying, well, what is it that you actually have in mind? We're very reasonable people, we're a good business people, and we're willing to do business, but we want to sit down and make certain that we understand fully what is the solution, because one thing we do not want is to have a solution that comes out of left field that is actually worse than the problem.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the programme there. And of course, I gave a lot more time to Mr. Rocha than the other guests, because it is his country we're talking about. And by the time this programme is aired, it's very likely that we have a decision from the Irish government on the country's economic future. So thank you again to Mr. Dick Rocha in Dublin, in London, Louis Gargaud, and in Singapore, Jim Rogers. And of course, the viewers, thanks very much for watching The Inside Story. I'm sure you've got a lot to say about this subject. We'd be very happy to hear from you. You can email your comments and suggestions to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.